Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And tell the show, we're talking about what renters really want and are us property investors giving it to them. Now, this is really interesting because we've been digging through data from realestate.co.nz, looking at what tenants are really searching for on that website. And the most amazing thing, Andrew, is they are collecting about 4 million rental searches every single month, right? So that's renters going on looking for properties. And if we analyze this data, we can understand, well, what are tenants really looking for? And I'm also matching this up today with what is actually on that website. So what do tenants want, and are us property investors really giving it to them? Now, Andrew, why might this be useful?
Well, I think sometimes as landlords, we can make the assumption that we think we know what a tenant wants, but it might not actually be the case. It might not actually be that they're wanting a 3-bedroom unit in that particular area. It might not be that they're searching for a certain price in that area. So you want to make sure that you satisfy the demands of your tenants.
And I suppose a couple of days ago, we talked about how in a rural part of Auckland, like Muriwai, there are a very, very low number of rental searches. But if there are a low number of rental searches, but there are almost no properties online available, well, that can still mean that there is high demand relative to the supply that is there, and so you can still have a good demand for tenants. Whereas if you compare that to Henderson, just as an example, there is a lot more rental demand there, but if there is heaps of rental supply, well, maybe you still don't get that demand-supply imbalance. And so we can't just look at where are there lots and lots of searches and where are there not many searches. We've also got to consider the supply side element as well, which is effectively what today is all about. So how are we going to figure this out? One of the main things I wanted to dive in and look at was the number of rental searches per listing. And I've started by looking in Wellington, and it's quite interesting. Over the last 6 months, there are some places like in Stokes Valley, which is in Lower Hutt, you've had 26,000 rental searches. But because you've had 25 listings, you've only had 1,000 rental searches. Oh, I've spelt the word searches wrong on my map as well. I've said put searches. You've only had 1,000 rental searches per listing. Whereas if you compare that to another area like Elsdon, you've had a lower number of searches, about 16,500 searches, but you've only had 2 listings, which means there are 8,000 searches per listing as opposed to 1,000. So that gives you a sense of, okay, maybe you've got less rental demand there, but because you've got so little rental supply, you've actually got a good amount of demand per listing on there. What's your take on that, Andrew?
It's just really interesting to see that we would automatically assume that because there's a lack of listings that there's not an opportunity there. So you might look at that and say, oh, Elson, why would you buy a rental property there? There's only 2 properties available there. But actually that might be the opportunity because there's still a lot of searches.
Yeah, that's the really fascinating thing. But the other thing about just looking at these maps in Wellington is there's no real pattern. Usually I would expect that maybe some areas that are red, i.e. there is a lot of rental demand per listing, that it might be concentrated in one area, but it's pretty sporadic. One thing that's interesting is some of the more wealthy areas like Miramar have like a good amount of searches per listing. 27,000 people have been searching for rental properties there compared to only 7 listings. But even some smaller areas like Karaka Bays, there's only been 1 listing there and 17,500 searches. And one other thing that's really surprised me, though now that I say it, it's maybe not as surprising, a lot of the rental demand is up around Porirua City. So even if we look at an area like Cannons Creek, which historically has not been the nicest area, you've got a lot of searches going on there, 22,000 searches compared to over only 5 listings in the data that's been supplied by realestate.co.nz. And so again, property investors should feel pretty comfortable about saying, okay, if I rent a property there, I'll probably get a tenant. But what's interesting is not only, okay, let's visualize this data on a map and think about which suburbs have higher demand compared to the number of listings. We've also got to think about the sort of properties that are renting. And this is where it gets absolutely cooked, Andrew.
Yeah, so let's take Palmerston North. So if we look at Palmerston North, we see that houses make up 71% of the actual listings. So that's what property investors have got available and are renting out at the moment or attempting to rent out.
Yeah, that's your rental supply.
Yeah, but in terms of the searches, they're way less. 40% of people looking for a rental property in Palmerston North are looking for a house. So there's this major disconnect between the type of properties which are being made available and what people are actually wanting. Whereas if you look at apartments, I find this really interesting for Palmerston North. The demand far outweighs the supplies for apartments in Palmerston North, which I wouldn't have thought would have a huge demand for apartments.
Yeah, so that means that over 20% of the searches on realestate.co.nz since the start of the year in Palmerston North have been apartments, but apartments make up only 8% of the rental supply. And so you think, oh, okay, well, maybe it's actually pretty easy to rent an apartment in Palmerston North, according to this data. Now, the reason we wanted to bring this up is it's really surprising. Like, if I was just sitting here thinking about Palmerston North, and we just pick on it because it's a mid-sized city in New Zealand, pretty typical all up. And you'd say, okay, there's probably a lot of houses there. That's maybe what tenants want. So you might expect that.
A 3-bedroom house would have been an obvious choice for an investment, right?
Yeah, that maybe 80% of people are looking for 3-bedroom houses, and they might only make up 60% of the supply. And so those would be really easy to rent. But this actually showed the exact opposite. So for instance, people often talk about townhouses that, okay, maybe we see so many townhouses being built. That means that maybe there's a lot of supply and there's not the demand for it. But actually, again, in Palmerston North, what we've actually seen is that townhouses make up about 14% of the rental demand in terms of searches, but they've only made up about 5% of the rental supply. And if we look at these searches per listing, we actually see that there is the greatest demand supply imbalance for apartments and townhouses, and actually the lowest number of searches per listing for houses in Palmerston North. Doesn't that blow your mind?
It's completely opposite to what I expected because of the fact that you'd say, yeah, a house. And actually, it'd be fair to say that most investors obviously think like we do because that's why they've gone and bought houses for rentals.
I suppose the other thing that you've just got to temper with this data as well, and I'm sure we're going to get this in the YouTube comment section, is that if I am a renter looking in Palmerston North and I go to realestate.co.nz or I go to a Trade Me, most of the properties there, as we can see, over 70% of them are houses. So maybe when I go to those websites, I don't need to put in that I'm looking for a house if I'm looking for a property in Palmerston North, because 70% of them are houses anyway. So that's what's going to come up in the rental listings as I'm going through. And so what you've always got to be a little bit careful about is saying, well, this is what people are searching through in one interface, realestate.co.nz. And so this perfectly represents what people want in a rental property, which is probably not necessarily the case, because it'd be the same. If I was looking at a property in Hawera, in my own hometown, I don't need to put in that I am searching for a house because they're all houses anyway. And actually, why don't we do that? That'll be entertaining. Why don't we?
Okay.
Won't that be entertaining? Let's go to South Taranaki, Ed's hometown. We see that 80%, almost 80% of the properties there are houses. This actually surprises me that it still makes up about 60% of people searching. Isn't that fascinating? I can't believe this, because in South Taranaki, there are like no apartments. Like there are very, very few apartments.
And yet people are looking for them.
16% of the rental searches on realestate.co.nz were for apartments. That does blow my mind,
Do
to be honest, Andrew.
you think that maybe sometimes people think of they use the word apartment to mean a townhouse or a unit or something like that?
Maybe.
Possibly.
I don't know. I went to school in Hawera, so
I didn't even know
everybody graduates.
Yeah, I don't even think they had the internet there yet.
Well, but what's interesting is that, again, if we think about that demand versus supply, in South Taranaki district, we're seeing almost 5,000 rental searches per townhouse listing. Compare that to about 1,500 rental searches per house listing. So that is really fascinating.
Now, while we're on the topic of what tenants want, I think the number one thing that I always say is people are focused on price. So can we talk about price when they're searching?
Yeah, this amazed me as well. So if we look at Christchurch City, where we record this, I've mapped out the amount of rental searches by price range. And I expected to see something totally different from what came out. So what I thought would happen is that we'd see a lot of tenants searching for properties around the $400 a week mark. tenants wanting really, really affordable properties, and that we might see that investors are supplying $600 a week properties, and that there would be this imbalance.
Mm.
We don't see that. In fact, the rental demand and the rental supply almost match up exactly in Christchurch. And what I mean by that is it's kind of the 550 mark is where both demand and supply peaks.
That's the sweet spot.
You
sorry,
like to come up with it's the sweet spot.
You want to
You
talk
can't
to me
ask.
about coming up with sayings. That is right bang in the middle of where the largest group of people are searching and also supply the landlords are supplying the
Well,
stuff.
it's where you've got the thickest demand. But the reason I'm giving you hell for saying, well, that's the sweet spot, is when we look at the number of searches per listing, we actually see that it's pretty consistent across almost all price ranges, which means that if you had a more expensive property, say around the $800 mark, you've got a similar level of demand per supply, because this is all about demand and supply. We want to look for areas where there is high demand but limited supply. But actually, when we look at it from a price perspective, it's pretty consistent across the whole range. One thing that's interesting, though, just before I let you jump in, see that it really spikes once you hit $1,000 a week. So once you hit $1,000 a week, and this is pretty consistent across most regions, you get this massive surge in people searching for those properties. Now, I don't think that means that, oh, wow, if we go and list our properties at $1,000 a week, there's going to be all of this demand. I think that probably tells you that people are very nosy and they say, I wonder what I could get for $1,000 a week. And so you get a bit of a spike there because there aren't that many listings. So that interesting search behavior comes out.
Is this the same in somewhere like Auckland?
Yeah, let's take a little look-see. Which part of Auckland? Do you want North Auckland, South Auckland?
Let's go South Auckland.
Cool. So we'll be looking for Manukau City. And we see, this is quite interesting, there is a high amount of supply versus demand at around that kind of 650 mark, just over the last kind of 9 months. So we actually see quite a bit of demand at that lower price range as well. So if we were to look at the searches per listing, in a place like South Auckland, we are seeing a lot of searches at that lower end. Again, we do see that spike in searches around that $1,000 a week mark. Now, to be honest, Andrew, this was so surprising that I did wonder whether there was a bit of foul play here going on.
Foul play.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. Data abuse
Okay.
by ourselves.
Oh, wow. Data abuse. It's come back.
And so if you go to realestate.co.nz, their kind of search experience is that you go there and you might look for properties in Otara in Manukau City, and you say, okay, I'm going to search for those. Then you start seeing what is available, and then you say, okay, now I'm going to refine by price, and I'm going to put a price range in there. So because I have already seen what properties are available, I then adapt my demand to get a better listing. Now, that is different from TradeMe's search experience, where if you go and look for a property for rent on TradeMe, you put in the price range you're looking for before you go and start looking at listings. So all I'm saying is with the realestate.co.nz data, because you search for a suburb or a region first, you see what's available, you then adapt your search to say, okay, I'm looking for these sorts of properties based on what you've already seen. So that's why I'm saying you can't then look at this data and think it perfectly represents the demand that is out there. It is a really good signal. It's better to have this data than not. But you can't look at this data and just say this perfectly represents what tenants want.
Right. So if you're looking at TradeMe's data, you might get a more accurate picture because they're going to put that in first before they have their desires refined by the reality of the market.
Yeah, that's right. So a tenant going in would give more data before they about what they're actually looking for before they start to see those listings. Whereas if you see those listings up front, you start to say, okay, based on what I've already seen, I'm looking for something around that $600 a week mark. And so I then adapt my search based on having seen that. And then in this data, it's reflected as demand. But the reason we're talking about realestate.co.nz data is they were very kind enough to give me the data, whereas TradeMe told me to bugger off. And one of the things that I was going to say, Andrew, is the difficulty with trying to figure out what tenants want is there's kind of no perfect way to do it. So, for instance, we released the tenant tool, which I've actually, I've recently updated the data on just last week, actually. I paid a couple of grand to Stats NZ and they gave me some more. So if I searched for properties in Otara and Auckland, I'm able to see what sort of properties people are renting, and they're renting a lot of 3-bedroom homes, not renting a lot of 2-bedroom homes. We've got their incomes and we know how many cars those families tend to have. And I remember when I first launched this tool, people said, okay, that tells me what people are currently renting, but that doesn't tell me what people really want to rent, right? So maybe people are only living in 3-bedroom properties in Otara because that is what is available. And you say, okay, fine, I can understand that argument. So let me go and look at what they're searching for on realestate.co.nz. And then you could argue, well, that's what they're searching for, but that doesn't tell you what they're actually willing to pay for and what compromises they are willing to make. That's where you need to look at the tenant tool. And you go, okay, I kind of understand that. And then you might say, okay, well, with the realestate.co.nz data, what happened there is people have already looked at the answers, so they're adapting their demand. So that doesn't tell you what people really want. And so you think, okay, well, we better go run a survey or a poll. And then people say, oh, well, that's what people say they want, but what are they really willing to pay for? You need to go back and look at the tenant tool and see what they're actually willing to pay for. And so there are strengths and weaknesses within any way you're trying to figure out tenant demand. So you've got to put it all together. And sometimes I do see people say about a specific podcast episode, oh, but you haven't considered this. You're like, oh, yes, we did, but it was 200 episodes ago. So you've got to look at all of this put together. And in fact, I was going to say, Andrew, I've started looking at scientific polling. And
what's that?
I love asking you this in front of the cameras because then hopefully you'll say yes.
Oh.
So, you know, when you get called up by a poll company, a market research company, and they want to know like which political party you're voting
There's
for.
only one person I know in my entire 40 years of existence who's answered one of those.
That's me, isn't
Yes.
it? Oh, I took great pleasure in telling this poor pollster who I voted
Yes,
for.
I do have 35 minutes free.
You want to know my opinions about Chris Luxon and Chris Hipkins? How much time have you got? No, a yes or no will suffice. No, I've got context to give. Where was I going with
Scientific
this?
polling.
Oh, scientific polling. So I was thinking maybe we should hire one of these companies to call up like 1,000 renters and ask them a bunch of questions. But it's quite expensive.
How much is it?
Oh, it's somewhere between 10 and 15 grand.
That is a lot of money.
Yeah,
It's coming out of the marketing budget.
So I was thinking maybe if we get 1,000 likes on this video on YouTube, we might run that poll and share that as well.
How about you get $1 for every like you get?
Well, then I'd have to get like 10,000, 15,000 likes. We're not going to get that on this YouTube video. You got to be realistic.
Well, not with that
Andrew.
attitude.
Okay, so if you want us to go even further and run that scientific poll and share that with you guys, just hit like on this YouTube video. And if I get 1,000 likes, I'll probably go ahead and run those numbers. What? Look at you smirking.
Too late now, isn't it? You've said it.
So hit the like button on this YouTube video, and if we get 1,000 likes, we will run that scientific poll. But just before we wrap up, what's kind of the main takeaway for investors from this?
I think the key thing is to not get too caught up in thinking that you're right about exactly what a tenant wants. Like that information from Palmerston North. I think too often we might say, okay, well, this is what we see. Anecdotally, okay, we know that there are a bunch of houses there, so that's what tenants want. And sure, there might be a lot of successful people renting out houses there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't an opportunity with a different type of product or a different price range or something like that.
Fantastic. Let's wrap it up there. And if you want us to run that scientific poll, make sure you hit the like button on this YouTube video. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can just Google Opus Partners YouTube if you want to see some of the graphs we're sharing as well. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of New Zealand property.